Introduce our next speaker, who again is very well to us all, Robert Irwin, for the work that he's done on the Arabian Nights, his companion to the Arabian Nights, his editions of various translations of the Arabian Nights, most recently, in fact, a translation of a related manuscript, which overlaps a little bit, I gather, The Tales of the Marvellous and the News of the Strange, which Malcolm Lyons and Robert Irwin have produced just in November last year. And I gather that there are another 101 nights in the press about to come out, as well as an anthology of pre-Islamic poets. So over to you, Robert. Yes.
Thank you. First, an apology. I shall have very little to say about Galland. Instead, I should be talking about a parallel literary craze. And then a quote from Flaubert's Dictionnaire des idées reçues. He has this to say about hieroglyphs. Language of the ancient Egyptians, invented by priests to conceal their shameful secrets. To think that there are people who understand them, but perhaps the whole thing is a hoax. Well, bogus Egyptology is a depressing topic in which charlatans rub shoulders with the gullible, and its chronicles bear no relationship to the centuries which they purport to record. And to be more specific, and here a second apology, the Abbé Terrasson's lengthy novel Sethos is monumentally boring. Still, certain points of interest may arise. But first, some preliminary observations. By the time Muslim armies conquered Iran, the region's inhabitants had lost the ability to read cuneiform, and having done so, they consequently forgot about the achievements of the Achaemenids, and subsequently, the historiographical vacuum was filled by the construction of an almost entirely bogus sequence of kings and combats that was celebrated in Firdausi's Shahnameh and other less well-known epics. This manner of proceeding is vaguely comparable to J.R.R. Tolkien's attempt in Lord of the Rings to restore to England the sorts of heroes and legends that he believed had been lost as a result of the Norman conquest. Again, the same sort of thing happened in Egypt, in medieval Egypt. By the time the Arab invaders arrived in that land, the natives had lost the ability to read hieroglyphics and were therefore ignorant of the true achievements of the pharaohs. Nevertheless, bogus histories were invented to account for the pyramids and the other monuments of the mysterious past. In the late 12th century, Ibn Wasif Shah filled the gap with Kitab Jawahir al-Buhur, a chronicle rich with marvels in which he was able to list the kings of Egypt before and after the deluge, Nekros, Misram, Ankam, Arbak, Lujim, and so on. At around the same time, another Egyptian, Murtada ibn Khafif, produced a similar pseudo-history of his land, and this was translated into French in 1666 by Pierre Vattier, one of Galland's teachers. Michael Cook has characterized Hermetic history as teeming with priests learned in astrology and magic, sage rulers, marvelous constructions, talismans, treasures, ancient wisdom, and occasional glimpses of monotheist truth. In Tales of the Marvellous and News of the Strange, an Arabic story collection which perhaps dates from the 11th century, in the opening of the story of Mahlier and Mahub, the Christian monk Matrun is summoned by the Muslim general Amr ibn al-As to explain the existence of a vast building at Ain Shams, Heliopolis. And in the conclusion of the fantastic story he tells, it becomes the ruins of a royal castle, though in historical fact, the vast building in question must have been the great temple of the sun god Ra in Ain Shams. And that leads me to wonder, but it's only a passing thought, if the strikingly bizarre imagery in that story may not have been inspired by the visual imagery of ancient Egyptian frescoes in some temple or other. Moving on now to the fantasy history of Egypt in the West, when did the Orient become the West's mysterious Orient? An early visual premonition of the mysterious Orient is to be found in the 1480s mosaic image of Hermes Trismegistus and his disciple in the pavement of Siena Cathedral. Here Hermes, in long flowing robes and pointed hat, confronts a deferential figure in a turban. Hermes is flanked by two sibyls. His left hand rests on a table supported by sphinxes. The turbaned figure carries a book on which is written, take up letters and laws, O Egyptians. So here an ancient and secret wisdom is surely being transmitted. The notion of Egypt as a repository of lost secret wisdom into which one might be initiated, and of Egyptian science and learning as being the true source of Greek culture, was promoted by such figures as Marsilio Ficino, Pica della Mirandola, and Giordano Bruno, after the Hermetic treatises were brought to Florence sometime before 1480. Hermes Trismegistus was thought of as an Egyptian and as the institutor of many of the arts and sciences, as well as the builder of the pyramids. In 15th century Italy, the Corpus Hermeticum was believed to date back to the 5th century BC, although Isaac Casaubon later conclusively demolished this early dating. It actually probably dates from the 2nd century AD. As for the mysterious Egyptian hieroglyphs, the only guide that seemed available to Renaissance scholars was the Hieroglyphica of Hor Apollo, a shadowy 4th century Greek writer. In his treatise, though a few of the hieroglyphs were correctly translated, most were assigned broad symbolic and allegorical meanings which must have been the product of guesswork. The Renaissance cult of Egyptian mysteries was reflected also in that strange bibliographic and artistic masterpiece, Hypnerotomachia Paulfilii, or Strife of Love in a Dream, a sort of novel published in 1499 by Francesco Colonna, in the illustrations of which feature obelisks, hieroglyphs, and pseudo-Arabic writing. Much later in the 17th century, the cult of Egyptian mysteries received a further fillip from the misguided researches into Egyptian hieroglyphics conducted by the balmy Jesuit Athanasius Kircher, 1602 to 1680. Kircher drew on an exiguous knowledge of Arabic and Coptic, as well as a great deal of Neoplatonic and Gnostic wisdom, in order to represent a wholly erroneous series of translations of the hieroglyphic mysteries. All this was revealed in a series of lavishly printed and bizarrely illustrated books, most notably Oedipus Egyptiacus, which purported to decipher the hieroglyphs on the Pamphylian obelisk in Rome. And Kircher, not a modest man, he compared his achievement to the discovery of America, to the invention of the printing press, or the finding of a new planet. His purported decipherment not only allowed one to understand the ancient Egyptian mysteries, but it also provided the key to understanding Indian, Chinese, and Aztec writings, as the Egyptians had colonized those regions. Why else would Mexico have pyramids if it weren't that the Egyptians had brought them there? This kind of thinking is classified today as hyperdiffusionism. And for today's purposes, the most important aspect of Kircher's approach to hieroglyphs has been well summarized by Umberto Eco in The Search for a Perfect Language. These symbols were initiatory, because the allure of Egyptian culture was given by the promise of knowledge that was wrapped in an impenetrable and indecipherable enigma, so as to protect it from the idle curiosity of the vulgar multitudes. And Kircher's ideas about Egypt were given remarkable visual and tactile expression in the engravings, frescoes, and furniture devised by Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who visited Kircher's Museum of Curiosities and read Kircher, and Piranesi also drew on recently discovered pseudo-Egyptian frescoes at Pompeii and Herculaneum, and he used Egyptian imagery in the Café of the Englishman, Café dell'Inglese in Rome, which featured hieroglyphs, sphinxes, the apis bull, the hawk, the scarab, and so forth. Mozart, incidentally, also visited the Pompeii and Herculaneum frescoes at Herculaneum, and I'll come back to him shortly, I hope. And a century on, hyperdiffusionism was still the rage. The English antiquarian William Stukely, 1687 to 1765, decided that Stonehenge was erected by the Druids under the guidance of the Egyptian Hercules, while the Jesuit sinologist Joseph de Guines, 1721 to 1800, followed Kircher in presenting China as an Egyptian colony. Consequently, Chinese ideograms might provide the key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphics. But Kircher and de Guines were recondite scholars who wrote for other scholars, and the mysterious Orient had not yet entered popular consciousness. It took a bad novel to make this happen. Séphos, histoire ou vie tirée des monuments anecdotes de l'ancienne Égypte, traduite d'un manuscrit grec trouvé à Alexandrie sous Marc Aurèle, was published anonymously in 1731 by the Abbé Jean Terrasson, 1670 to 1750. This Oratorian priest was a professor at the Collège de France, where he taught classical philosophy. He was a leading partisan of the moderns, and in this capacity he published in 1715 a famous attack on the merits of the Iliad. Terrasson, a latter-day disciple of Descartes and a Freemason, was also suspected of atheism. In the predictably eloquent words of Paul Hazard, we shall now find the figures on the stage more clearly defined, more richly caparisoned, the scenery and accessories more elaborate, sistra, papyrus, ibis, lotus, and now at last behold the wise man of Egypt, the Sethos of the Abbé Terrasson, the destined idol of the 18th century. Sethos will turn out not to be a hero, but a philosopher, not a king, but a guardian of tradition and the things of the past, not a Christian, but an adept deeply versed in the mysteries of Eleusis, a pattern for rulers and all men to follow. Terrasson's fat, moralizing, didactic novel was set in the 11th century BC, when the Greeks were yet a barbarous nation, whereas the Egyptians had attained to politeness. In this book, the eponymous Prince Sethos renounced his claim to the throne of Egypt, leaving the evil stepmother Daluka to run things badly on behalf of her sons. Sethos instead asked to be initiated into the mysteries of Isis in Memphis. As conjured up by Terrasson, the place seems to be one vast university campus. The initiation, which took place in the underground passages of a pyramid, identified as the tomb of Osiris, involved a period of purification and a sequence of ordeals. Whoever goes through this passage alone without looking behind him shall be purified by fire, by water, and by air, and if he can vanquish fears of death, he shall return from the bowels of the earth, he shall see light again, and he shall be entitled to the privilege of preparing his mind for the revelation of the mysteries of Isis. Sethos mastered all this, and the culmination involved him drinking from the cups of memory and oblivion, signifying, or rather the other way around, oblivion and memory, signifying death and rebirth. Once his instruction in the philosophic wisdom of the Egyptians, much of it by educational frescoes, was complete, he became a lawgiver and travelled throughout Egypt, bringing justice to its various regimes. And this echoes Diodorus Siculus' account of the civilizing conquest of Osiris. And so the reader is introduced to the Rhiphophagi, the Struthiophagi, the Hottentots, the Anthropophagi, and others. Towards the end of his anabasis, Sethos arrives at the Atlantes, where he discovers an elective monarchy, which he found to be the perfect utopia. Finally, he returned to Egypt, where his return precipitates the suicide of Daluka, the evil queen, and inaugurates the reign of one of her surprisingly virtuous sons. But Sethos himself prefers to spend the rest of his life in retreat as a philosophic hermit. As a novel of initiation, it can be compared to Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf and John Fowles's The Magus, though Sethos is certainly a lot less exciting than either. For Terrasson's narrative proceeds at a slow and stately pace. It was influenced by Madame de Scudéry's Artemène, ou Le Grand Cyrus, a 15,000-page historico-romantic farrago about the love of Cyrus the Great for Mondane, and Fénelon's Télémaque of around 1695 had an even stronger influence. That was a didactic novel in which Ulysses' son Telemachus travelled around Greece, had conversations with various rulers and philosophers, and in so doing indirectly criticised the court of Louis XIV. The extraordinary success of the Galland's translation of The 1001 Nights can in large part be explained by the turgidity and the politesse of the fictions it was competing against. The querelle, the quarrel of the ancients and moderns, was an important part of the context, had been an important part of the context for the reception of Perrault's fairy tales and a little later Galland's Mille et Une Nuits, since, among other things, the moderns argued for the worth of types of literature that didn't conform to the norms of ancient Greece and Rome. Terrasson was one of the moderns. But the paradox was that though he argued for the superiority and the anteriority of Egyptian culture, he relied entirely on Greek and Latin sources to do so, and consequently shaped that culture to conform to classical forms. Sethos was a didactic mirror for princes, and it was presumably addressed as guidance and criticism for the youthful Louis XV. Terrasson argued for enlightened despotism, but the stress was very much on enlightened. And this might have been seen as contentious, and it's perhaps for this reason that Sethos was anonymously published in Geneva. Terrasson's other main aim was to demonstrate the superiority and priority of Egyptian philosophy, religion, arts, and sciences over those of classical Greek civilization. And as noted, he relied to a large extent on Greek sources to do so. But he also relied on his own imagination. In the centuries before hieroglyphs had been deciphered, he conjured up an imaginary ancient Egyptian religion with ordeals and initiations similar to those of the Masons. He was a Mason. And he propped this up by drawing on classical sources, particularly Diodorus Siculus, Apuleius, and Iamblichus. Diodorus, the Sicilian Greek historian who flourished in the 1st century BC, was particularly important, and Terrasson had already translated him into French. Diodorus related how India had been conquered by the Egyptians, and Herodotus is another important source, according to whom it was the Egyptians who originated and taught the Greeks to use ceremonial meetings, processions, and liturgies, and Herodotus also claimed that the Egyptians were the first chroniclers and pioneers of the various forms of divination. Such were the embarrassments of fiction in the early 18th century that though Sethos was presented as fiction, the fiction was alleged to be the work of a Greek living in the time of Marcus Aurelius, and one who probably did actually have access to ancient Egyptian archives. Consequently, the novel was taken by many as a serious source on what ancient Egypt was like. The book was certainly influential. It was reissued several times and translated into English as The Life of Sethos, taken from private memoirs of the ancient Egyptians, translated from a Greek manuscript into French. And there were German and Italian translations. There was an English novel, Charoba, based on part of it. And there were imitations, L'Anarchiste sur les voyages extraordinaires d'un Égyptien dans la terre intérieure. In that fantasy, a young Egyptian living at the time of Semiramis, after various adventures, encountered a blue-skinned man who'd escaped from being held captive by serpent men in vast caverns. This is way before Jules Verne. And Sethos influenced the somewhat better-known, heavily didactic Voyage du jeune Anacharsis en Grèce by the classicist and Arabist Abbé Barthélemy, in which Egypt was one of the places visited by the young Scythian Anacharsis, who has an inexhaustible thirst for learning. And there's a play based on Sethos that was staged in 1739, and there was a ballet, The Birth of Osiris by Rameau in 1755. But today, Sethos is best known insofar as it is known at all for its role in shaping some of the initiatory rituals and visual imagery of the Freemasons, and then consequently for its important contribution to the plot and libretto of the Mozart's Magic Flute, 1791. The Orientalization of Masonry may have owed a little to the Rosicrucian legend of Christian Rosenkreutz, who was supposed to have travelled to Jerusalem and to a place called Damcar in the early 15th century. And having studied the Book of the World by Hermes Trismegistus, Rosenkreutz then translated it from Arabic into Latin and German. The specific Egyptianization of Freemasonry may have been initiated by an extremely obscure Englishman, George Cofton, who may have produced certain manuscripts on the sacred liturgy of the Egyptians, which were later acquired by the notorious charlatan Joseph Balsamo Count Cagliostro when he was in London in 1777. But Cofton is so very obscure that he and his manuscript may have been just two of Cagliostro's many inventions and just a story that Cagliostro later told the inquisitors in Rome. A little later, Cagliostro allegedly made contact with the Rosicrucians in Holland before going on in 1779 to produce the Ritual of Egyptian Freemasonry. The document, which survives in copies, propagated the so-called Egyptian rite and evoked Greco-Egyptian necromancy. It is full of fine-sounding noble guff. Though the ordeals and fasts are part of the Masonic initiation, there is nothing specifically Egyptian about them in the Ritual of Egyptian Masonry, and Cagliostro may not actually have read Terrasson. I suspect the primary aim of the document was to promote Cagliostro in his new role as the Great Copt. Nevertheless, the Egyptianization of Masonry was taken further in Vienna by an article written by the Viennese Ignaz von Born, 1742-91, master of the Lodge of Crowned Hope and author of the treatise about the mysteries of Egypt. This did draw heavily on Terrasson for its portrayal of those mysteries. Mozart was also a Mason and a member of the Lodge of the Crowned Hope, and not only had he read Terrasson, but so also had the Magic Flute's librettist, Emmanuel Schikaneder. So it is the Magic Flute's hero, Tamimo, has to face a series of difficult ordeals organised by the priests of the temple under the supervision of Sarastro, an Ignaz von Born type of figure, those ordeals involving silence, fire and water, before Tamimo attained to the status of initiate and at the same time won Pamina's hand. Imaginary Egyptology bore further strange fruit in the occult interpretation of the tarot pack. This was initiated by another Freemason, Antoine Coeur de Guébelin, 1719-84. In a chapter in his sprawling occult treatise Le Monde Primitif, he argued for the Egyptian origin of the major arcana. The card pack was a 78-page book created by the priests to set out their religious doctrines, but in a disguised form, so that those documents would not be penetrated by the profane. Coeur de Guébelin also argued that the original meaning of Paris was ship of Isis, and Isis was worshipped by the Druids on the site where Notre Dame now is. Later, the 19th century occultist Eliphas Levi drew on Sethos and on Kirch's Oedipus Egyptiacus to present an alternative interpretation of the tarot pack as setting out a path of mystical initiation. Although Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphics was underway in the 1820s, the pseudo-histories of Egypt continued to have an afterlife. Gérard de Nerval's Voyage en Orient, 1851, was a most strange melange of travel journalism, fantasy fiction, and occult speculation. It's a sort of scrapbook. It's a scrapbook in which the Arabian Nights features very prominently. It's repeatedly referred to. Specifically, Nerval drew on von Hammer's Conte inédit des Mille et une Nuits, presumably in Trébutien's 1828 translation. So he sees the Orient as a kind of Arabian Nights dream world, and he sort of reincarnates. Some of the stories seem to be reincarnated before his eyes. But Nerval also padded his narrative out with gleanings and extensive passages plagiarized from obscure texts that dealt with the imaginary history of pharaonic Egypt and the no less imaginary proto-Masonic rituals of initiation that were then practiced. And he did read widely, and his texts he drew on included the Hypnerotomachy of Paulfilie, L'Egypte de Murtadi, and Oedipus Egyptiacus. Just short of the pyramids, Nerval encountered a sheikh in a kiosk who apparently was well up in L'Egypte de Murtadi, was able to tell this Nerval legendary story of the pharaoh Surid and how he built the pyramids in anticipation of the deluge. But above all, Nerval recycled whole passages from Sethos. I think I won't go into the details here, but he just takes passages wholesale, hardly changing a single word. The initiate goes through the initiatory trials as set out in Terrasson's novel, but whereas Terrasson is such a goody-goody, has Sethos such a goody-goody that he retires to a life of solitude and hermetic meditation, Nerval, who was sexually obsessed and crazed at this time, had a very unhappy love affair, seemed to have spent a lot of time in Egypt and Lebanon looking for another woman, has the culmination of all these ordeals and tests and drinking the drink of oblivion as being transported to an island where he meets a beautiful woman. It's not just a vision that the woman is flesh and blood. And though Nerval was not actually a Mason, as I can tell, he was steeped in Masonic lore, and this coloured his account of the Egyptian mysteries. A little later in Les Illuminés, Nerval suggested in Cazotte's pseudo-Arabian Nights story, The Night, the protagonists seemed to have some of the characteristics of Terrasson's Egyptian initiate. And in the same book, Nerval argued that Sethos was one of the potential sources of Martinist and later Jacobin infidelity. So the blending of Masonic themes with those of Oriental mystery and fantasy was perpetuated in the 19th century by Eliphas Levi and Gérard de Nerval. Moreover, in the opening decades of that century, reports of ancient Egyptian mysteries would be supplemented by lurid and inaccurate accounts of the histories of the Carmathians, Hashishins, and Druze, produced by such well-known Orientalists as von Hammer-Purgstall and Sylvestre Sassy, in which these sects were presented as the villainous precursors of the Masons, the Carbonari, and the Jacobins. The 1001 Nights, with its jinn, flying horses, flying carpets, magical transformations, further contributed to the myth of the mysterious and magical East. Ordeals feature in such stories as Judah and his brethren, Wardan the Butcher and the Bear, and Aladdin. And this occult strain pervades quite a lot of 19th and 20th century culture. So it is that William Butler Yeats, who's an enthusiast for the Knights, particularly the Madras version, received messages from Leo Africanus in seances. Cancino Asens, the Spanish translator of the Knights, gave the whole translation a theosophical spin and interpretation. In Magic and Theory and Practice by Aleister Crowley, Crowley recommends that the aspirant to occult knowledge should read the Arabian Nights. The Satanist painter Austin Osman Spare asserted the essential truth of the Nights. Sax Rohmer, the author of the Fu Manchu mysteries and stories, was never actually all that interested in China or Chinamen. That was just a fluke which made him the money. What gave him a real passion in life was his early reading of the 1001 Nights. And he recycles elements of the 1001 Nights in the Fu Manchu stories, many of which are set in Egypt. Sax Rohmer was a great enthusiast for Richard Burton and for Egyptology and for Flinders Petrie, so he names one of the heroes of. He really was an Arabist, at least in hope. And one could point to Gurdjieff, whose father was allegedly a professional storyteller and would invariably end his chain of stories with a story from the Arabian Nights. And Gurdjieff recycles Arabian Nights stories in Tales of Beelzebub. So it's a mistake, I think, to look at the influence of the Arabian Nights in Western culture as a matter of, did Jane Austen read it? What influence did it have on Proust? Was it behind Dickens? Quite ordinary people, quite stupid people, hack writers and crank occultists were also influenced by this kind of source. Together, Sethos and the 1001 Nights contributed to the image of Egypt as a land of mystery, ordeal, and initiation. And this, in turn, made a major contribution, not only to occultism, but also to pulp literature of the kind produced by Karl May and Sax Rohmer, as well as to the iconography of music hall conjuring.
That was a bit of a roller coaster. but there is time for a few statements, questions, comments on what Robert has been telling us. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Robert. This was the usual Robert Owen.
Oh dear.
At his best. But something that strikes me as very important was one of your statements, which I would say is probably so far heavily underestimated, and this is communication between the Knights and literature of the day. What everybody talks about, as you made it clear at the end, about how literature is influenced by the Knights and how literature responds to the Knights. But the Knights also responded to contemporary literature. Mm-hmm. Probably in some way. I mean, we know at least that part of the initiative Galland had was to respond to French fairy tale literature, which he obviously despised. He speaks about the tyrannie des contes de fées and all this stuff taken from Greek literature and from shepherd literature and God knows what. But, well, my question would be, if you think about this, how did the Galland's translation respond to literature, communicate with contemporary literature? What would you say?
Well, it's clear he Frenchified the Abbasid Umayyad courts in his narratives, and the most Frenchified of the stories are the orphan stories, where the input is enormous, and the way the people speak, including Aladdin's mother, speaks a very elaborate and courtly French, would be quite inappropriate for an Arab woman of her presumed status. That's all Galland, and so the way the palaces are described and the gardens described. So he's responding, he's giving his audience, in the first instance, women at court, I believe, exactly what they want. I think that's most of it. Not sure what else you might be getting at. Let me add one other thing there. It's not just that things look French and sound French. It's also that what's striking about the orphan stories is how much stress there is on motivation, how you actually get inside minds of people, how it's explained why they're going to do something. This is something that's not so evident in the Arab stories for which there is an original. Again, it's Galland writing to meet the expectations of his audience and the conventions of French literature at the time. Sorry.
Yes, Richard.
Thank you very much for drawing our attention to this more or less hidden layer in European literary history and cultural history, which is, I think, not really hidden at all. It's quite visible, but it's ignored. And this is especially because literary history is usually written as a kind of trajectory to the triumph of the realist bourgeois novel, etc. But I think this kind of reconstruction of literary histories with its substratums of more or less unconscious development changes our perspective on literary history, Western literary history, and the role of Orientalism. So I would like to ask you if you could expand a little bit more on the idea that in fact the trend of Romanticism in European literature, which is usually traced to the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, could in fact be drawn much further back to, for instance, the translation of the 1001 Nights. Would you see a connection between the emergence of Romanticism within the 18th century through the influence of the 1001 Nights, which was perhaps temporarily obscured by the realist trends in European literature, but which re-emerged in the 19th century?
Yeah, I think it's probably quite easy to argue for the influence of the Arabian Nights on Romanticism in Germany, the whole gang of people around the Schlegels and so forth. I can't remember all the names, but Hauff and Tieck and people like that. I don't think it would be difficult to do that, but I think one could go back further in a way and go back to Terrasson again. Piranesi is developing the idea that a thing can be terrifying and mysterious, and that is exciting and sublime, and that seems to me to lead directly to Edmund Burke's famous treatise on the nature of the sublime, and that's one of the important documents for founding the Romantic movement. So this idea of things to be of great size and fearful and perhaps even presaging death and that kind of thing, it gets Piranesi excited and get people after him excited.
Yes.
Just a question about the Masons. There was a book recently on imperial British literature and Masonry, but it's a very general book. It's Canada, New Zealand, and I think Egypt is only one aspect of that. I was just wondering if more work has been done. So my own research would suggest that there's much more overlap between Orientalism and the Masons in, say, 18th and 19th century British Orientalism.
Yeah, I don't know. The London Library's holdings on the subject are not impressive. The number of books I looked at, which had little or nothing to say of any historical worth at all. It does seem that the origins of Masonry, the real origins, go back to, I think, I don't know, top of my head, the 16th century Scotland, where it really was a kind of craft organisation, and then it evolves in London coffee houses into something rather different. But the Egyptian edition comes quite late 18th century, yeah.
Well, I meant more the influence of many of the Orientalists we study might have been involved with or influenced by their engagements.
Yes. Well, in the case of de Sacy and von Hammer, it's a negative influence. You know, they see that Masonry is very important, very dangerous. It caused the French Revolution, deaths of so many people. So they really despise it completely. Orientalists who were influenced by Masonry, apart from Nerval, off the top of my head, I suspect quite a few of the Spanish Orientalists were Masons. It goes with the politics. If you're an Arabist in Spain, you tend to be anti-monarchical, anti-Catholic, and you're very likely to be a Mason. I'd be surprised if that famous 19th century one, the one that advised Burton, Gallegos, I'd be surprised. I think he was a Mason, but I'd have to check. But yeah, I mean, von Hammer presents ideas of secret Gnostic, sinister initiations which the Templars inherit and pass on to the West, and he thinks this is dreadful. But lots of people reading von Hammer, like A.E. Waite and Arthur Macklin, saying, "Hey, wow, this is really good. We want to tap into this."
Any other concluding comments?
Just a quick question about Tales of the Marvelous. If I heard it correctly, you said might well go back to the 11th century.
That's when it was compiled. The manuscript, of course, is later.
And what makes you think so?
Well, partly other people have guessed that, frankly, but also there are no references to things later in the 11th century. It's also clear that it was compiled at a time when the Umayyads were much more familiar to the compiler and the readers than the compiler of the 1001 Nights of the 15th century, who's mostly referencing later caliphs, particularly Harun al-Rashid. I mean, Harun al-Rashid is in Tales of the Marvellous, but he's much less prominent, and most of the stories feature Umayyads, and particularly the Umayyad governor of Basra features in a surprising number of stories. And yes, and the prominence of Christianity in the stories makes me think an early date is right, and that the Christians were much more numerous and were more prominent in public affairs and so forth. I think there are other indications, but I can't remember what from the top of my head.
Okay. Well, Robert, thank you very much for that very interesting parallel to what was happening with the translation of the 1001 Nights. And that has, in fact, given rise to a lot of very interesting ideas and discussion. So thank you very much. And we're right on time. So